I can't imagine what would be going through someone's mind. You know you're being marched to your death. Thinking about the things you don't get to do maybe, the loved ones you're leaving behind.
He says, you're not a bad person. I forgive you for what you're about to do.
He was at a very vulnerable point in his life. She became somebody that he confided in. That eventually grew into a friendship, which eventually grew into something more.
We discovered this affair that has been taking place.
Que dijo, mira, dice, eso sí te puedo decir, dice, si no sea para mí tu hijo, que no sea para nadie.
I'm trying to figure out what's her involvement. But then the plot thickens.
She was also married, which complicated things a lot more.
She wove this tale of being this damsel in distress, and he wanted to be her knight in shining armor.
He goes, something in me was telling me, don't do it, you're gonna get in trouble.
They decided to kill. No remorse, no sympathy.
She used him, and he rose to the bait. It's an unforgivable act, and one that justice demands that they fully pay for.
California's Central Valley is a picturesque landscape that serves as a gateway to the Sierra Nevada mountains.
We get a lot of tourists through here with Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, but the primary industry is agriculture.
There is a lot of farmland, a lot of grape vineyards, a lot of orchards like peaches and different types of stone fruit, orchards that go on for miles.
A lot of people who have been here have sacrificed. They have come from very far away to build their lives with absolutely nothing in their pockets other than a hope and a dream.
When Kings County receives a 911 call from a worried mother, Tomasa Reyes, on April 4th, 2016, they soon realize this family's American dream might be turning into a nightmare. Tomasa is searching for her son, 40-year-old church pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Por la semana que trabajaba en el Senger, ahí le rentó un cuartito con su amigo, nomás de lunes a el viernes o el sábado.
He worked for a chicken plant out in Sanger, which is in Fresno County in California. On the weekends, he'd spend with his parents, and they lived in Hanford, California, which is in Kings County.
Si trabajaba el sábado, llegaba hasta el sábado en la tarde.
He would oftentimes give the Sunday sermon at his church. And about 1:30 in the afternoon after church, he had told his mom and his stepdad that he was going to go get a tire fixed on his vehicle. And unfortunately, that's the last they ever heard from him.
Me levanté de la mañana el lunes y ya no estaba su troca. Los domingos él nunca duerme a la calle. Entonces yo le dije a mi esposo, le dije, levántate. Y mi esposo se levanta en la cama, ¿cómo que no llegó? Sí, ya se fue a buscarle, a ver si había tenido un choque o dónde fue.
With no sign of Abraham anywhere around their small town, his mother pleads with deputies for help finding him.
We ended up sending other detectives to his parents' house so we could get a little more information.
Algo malo ha de pasar. Llegaron los detectives en mi casa el lunes en la tarde, vinieron dos, preguntar cómo era mi hijo y yo le di todos los datos. Le enseñé la foto de su trocas y todo eso. Y pues así ya andaba yo investigando a ver por dónde estaba.
Originally from Oaxaca, Mexico, Abraham Gaspar Reyes grew up with his mother Tomasa, his stepfather Malicio, and his younger sister.
Malicio had a farm, so Abraham was exposed to, the farm life, the animals, the agriculture, and Malicio was also a pastor. So this is where Abraham got his inspiration to become a man of God.
Iba mucho a la iglesia y aquí lo vine a traerlo a la iglesia y le gustaba mucho aprender cosas de Dios, le gustaba mucho a rezar, a cantar. Cosa de Dios le encantaba mucho desde de edad de 5 años para adelante le encantaba.
After high school, Abraham stayed active in his local church and dreamed of having a family of his own.
Abraham met his wife, Mari, and he really fell in love with her, and they ended up having 2 beautiful children.
Era muy buena, muy amable, que era buena esposa. Y pues tenía una niña también cuando llegó con él, pero él lo registró su apellido.
In 2005, Abraham made the difficult decision to leave his wife and children behind while he searched for better opportunities in America.
Abraham wanted to provide a better life for his kids. Living in Oaxaca, there was not a lot of access to education or more opportunities.
He came to America to provide for his family, like many of those people who come from other countries and stay, to be able to make a better future than what they were having where they once was.
Abraham joined his parents in the town of Hanford, California.
Cuando él dejó a mexicano, le digo, ok, vamos pues. Y lo llevé en el field a trabajar.
They would hoe the cotton, take out all the weeds. But Abraham didn't only do that. Whatever job was available in the field, he was more than capable.
Abraham always planned to return to his wife and children in Mexico.
Él le mandaba todo dinero, porque era su sueño nomás llegar, tener su casa y regresar allá con su familia.
Being a migrant worker, being by yourself, basically starting from scratch, took him a lot longer than he imagined. And during this time, his wife decided to end their relationship. For Abraham, it was very painful. He came here in search of a better life to provide for his wife, and that was something that was extremely hurtful for him. So Abraham was in the process of a divorce.
Abraham turned to his faith, finding solace at a local church.
At the time, I was the Sunday school teacher, and then Abraham shows up, and he was very intelligent. He was very knowing of God's word, and so he became very helpful in my ministry.
Y ya empezó a tener mucha amistad con los jóvenes. Le gusta mucho platicar, que el maravilloso es el Dios, que esto, lo otro. Y así, hasta que hubo una oportunidad que él empezó a pastorear a las iglesias.
He wanted to help the community, and the kids or the young people at the church really looked up to Abraham as a mentor.
Now, nearly 11 years after immigrating to America, the beloved pastor has gone missing, and law enforcement is speaking to his concerned parents.
We take the initial information from the family. At that point, that BOL goes out nationwide.
The following day, 2 field workers are tending to an almond orchard in nearby Early Mart, California, when they come across an alarming sight.
They were going down the row, and they came across a body. When they got closer, it was very apparent that the person wasn't alive.
They ended up calling 911, advised dispatch. Dispatch ends up calling our officers to the scene.
When we get there, the one thing that I remembered right off the bat was seeing this individual laying there, and he looked like he had left some type of a formal event.
It was someone who stood out. It wasn't somebody that was in the field, or we'll say like a farm worker that had a heart attack or passed out because of the heat or something like that.
As I approached, I could see that he had a gunshot wound to his head. There was evidence of insect activity, which indicated that he had been there most likely for a day or so.
We start checking for identification to see if he has anything on him so we could identify him.
We recovered the wallet. I went through it. and I located a bank card and a Mexican consular identification card to Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Based upon height, weight, all the identifying information on his license, it appeared consistent. Yeah, that's him. He had taken a gunshot to his right temple that went through his head and exited out the left.
The way that Abraham died, it was execution style. This was not something that could be mistaken for anything else. It was just cold-blooded murder.
Coming up, investigators uncover a possible motive in the murder of Abraham.
She would not allow him to look at another woman, to talk to another woman.
It would make sense that there was a jealousy component to this.
And a suspect comes clean.
It's kind of that old saying, confession is good for the soul. He spilled everything.
Just one day after he was reported missing, 40-year-old pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes has been found dead in an almond grove in Tulare County, California.
There were footprints where it looked like the ground was wetter when they had been made and the ground had sort of dried since. He also had dried dirt on the bottom of his shoes.
It was pretty apparent that he walked into the orchard of his own volition. We located a shell casing at the scene, which was able to quickly tell us that our suspicions were correct and that he was murdered at that location. It was a spent .44 caliber.
To pull the trigger on a large gun like that, it doesn't happen accidentally, because it takes some force to pull the trigger.
About 2 miles away from the orchard, there is a vineyard there. And in front of that, they found a truck belonging to Abraham Gaspar Reyes. There was a cell phone, there was like a jewelry box, but it was all just sitting on the seat.
We were able to get the vehicle and take it as evidence. Obviously go through with the photographing, collecting, and whatnot.
We try to find out as much as we can, as in anybody that might have been involved or might have wanted him hurt. And usually family is the best resource that we could get because they're the ones that know him the best.
That morning, investigators returned to the home of Tomasa and Malicio Reyes to deliver the heartbreaking news.
This family was devastated. Both mom and dad. Both mom and dad were extremely upset.
Me puse triste, sí, me dolió porque es mi hijo. Sentía que todo el mundo se cayó sobre mí. Sentí que todo se acabó para mí, pero Dios me dio esa fuerza, me dio ese valor de seguir adelante.
At this point, we don't know what a motive is. So we're really trying to determine why was he killed. The picture that was drawn for us was that Abraham was a pretty decent guy. He was an assistant pastor at his church, and he was somebody that was respected within his community and very loyal to his family. While we were talking, we discovered that he was separated from his wife and that he had 2 children in Mexico.
No se divorció, pero cuando ya supo ella que estaba en trámite de divorcio.
Abraham's parents say his failing marriage had been a source of stress for him. Another recent incident had also troubled Abraham, and it involved a new girlfriend, 40-year-old Angelita Reyes.
Y lo llevé en el fil a trabajar y ahí conocemos a esa mujer, era mayordoma. Y entonces ella empezaba a hablarles.
Angelita Reyes had 2 children at that time, 9 and 12 years of age, 2 boys, and was recently separated from her husband. They had been separated for about 7 months.
Abraham was at a very vulnerable point in his life, and Angelita came in. She was giving him attention, and she was cooking for him. And having that rejection from his wife, she really came in and filled in that void for him. She became somebody that he confided in. That eventually, grew into a friendship, which eventually grew into something more.
Dice ella, yo quiero a tu hijo. Le digo, yo no puedo decir que él quiera porque él tiene todavía a su esposa.
So not only did Abraham have this complicated relationship with his wife, Angelita was also married, which complicated things a lot more. Angelita began attending church with Abraham. She would sit in the pews and watch him preach.
All the people from the church would go to him and he would hug them and be very outgoing. After he started to date or see Angelita, he became very much reserved.
His demeanor totally changed, even with me. And I was old enough to be his mom, grandma even. He totally changed. She would not allow him to look at another woman, to talk to another woman, young or old.
There was one argument in particular that was a big argument between Abraham and Angelita, and Tomasa was there.
Que dijo, mira, dice, eso sí te puedo decir, dice, si no sea para mí tu hijo, que no sea para nadie.
And that struck her weird at the time, but of course she didn't think much of it. But now it's like, well, wait, the way that Angelita said it was almost kind of, malice in it.
The senior pastors at the church had tried to keep them apart because they knew Abraham still had his own children in Mexico and his wife, and they did not think it was a good idea for Abraham to be preaching during that time.
So this was not something that was looked at lightly by the church or his congregation.
He was in this dating relationship with Angelita from October, I believe, of 2014 through January of 2016.
Investigators learned that Abraham had ended his relationship with Angelita in order to focus on his ministry and his marriage with Mari.
He was fighting the flesh, He wanted the life of a pastor. He came back and he told the pastor, I'm back, pastor, this time for good. Everything in my life that was the hindrance is now gone.
La última vez que me dijo, dice Mari, que ahora sí va a venir para acá, dice. Ya tengo planes, ella ya tiene dinero para venirse para acá, ya le mandé. Ok, pues mijo, le dije, está bien.
For investigators, news of Abraham's romantic entanglements amounts to two promising leads.
It was very clear that this was an execution. It would make sense that there was a jealousy component to this.
So they needed to track down Mari and Angelita to see if they had any type of involvement in this.
Less than 48 hours into the murder investigation of 40-year-old Abraham Gaspar Reyes, police are exploring two possible persons of interest: Abraham's wife, Mari, and his ex-girlfriend, Angelita Reyes.
They were able to track down Mari, Abraham's wife, in Mexico. They learned that their relationship was in good standing.
The wife finally wanted to come to the United States to be with him.
We discovered that they were still communicating, they were still talking, but that basically she was there, he was here.
She had never been here, and so she was ultimately eliminated as a suspect from his murder.
Investigators next travel to the registered address for Angelita Reyes. When they arrive, her husband, Javier, agrees to speak to them, but he claims Angelita moved into an apartment of her own 7 months earlier.
Angelita had been married with Javier Garcia, and just one day she up and left him, saying that he wasn't a fun person anymore, and she left. Angelita did tell Javier that she had been seeing Abraham.
When asked if Angelita could have anything to do with Abraham's murder, Javier is quick to say no.
He did not think she was a violent person.
Investigators immediately go to Angelita's new apartment in Bakersfield.
They did find her down in Bakersfield. They asked her to come with them because at that point she was a suspect, but they didn't know if she was responsible. She readily agreed.
At the station, Angelita is escorted to an interview room.
She was very comfortable and sitting there and talking, and like almost to the point where she was flirting with the investigators.
She talks about, that she has a husband, they're not divorced, but they've been separated for a long time, that they have children together. She then talks about how she was dating Abraham, but she tries to make it that she called it off. Well, tell us about Abraham. Tell us about, the last time you talked with him. And she said, oh yeah, well no, I did talk to him on the phone Saturday night, but I didn't see him.
She denies meeting or seeing Abraham on the day that he went missing. So probably an hour or so into the interview, Angelita agrees to take a voice stress analyzer, which for all intents and purposes is a lie detector test.
The test suggests Angelita is lying about the last time she saw Abraham. So they pressure her to come clean.
The investigators went back at her a second time, and when confronted with this information, she finally starts to talk.
She said, well, we got together Sunday, April 3rd, which was the last day he was seen alive. And then she's like, Abraham was blackmailing me. And the detective goes, tell me more about that. She's like, well, he took naked photos of me and made these videos of me and was threatening me because I broke up with him. He was threatening me to make them public if I didn't get back together with him. This doesn't fit the narrative of who Abraham is as a person that's being presented by every other person who knew him.
What she said made no sense. We didn't necessarily believe Angelita's statement.
That's when Angelita tells police that she had confided in her roommate, 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo.
They worked at the packing house together, working in farm labor.
She then eventually admits that, oh yeah, they were kind of dating.
Angelita and Jesus started dating soon after she and Abraham broke up in January of 2016.
She said that Jesus was a jealous man and he wanted to harm Abraham because he didn't like how Abraham was treating Angelita.
Angelita claims that on Sunday, April 3rd, she had plans to meet up with Abraham alone.
Abraham had some jewelry of Angelita's from the relationship, but after they had broken up, Angelita had then wanted that jewelry back.
She says, I went on my own on Sunday, April 3rd to meet with Abraham in Early March. I traveled alone. She says, all of a sudden, Jesus Jeronimo shows up and he's just in a rage. And she said that Jesus walked Abraham at gunpoint into the field and shot him and walked away.
She had said that she didn't get out of the car, she didn't see what happened, and we really didn't believe that.
By then, the detectives are like, did he really come separate? She starts changing her stories.
And it's just obvious that she is telling one lie after another after another. I say let them lie. Eventually you're going to be out of excuses and the truth's going to come out.
I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's her involvement? At that point, I'm wondering, is she the actual killer?
2 days into the murder investigation of Abraham Gaspar Reyes, his ex-girlfriend, Angelita Reyes, has just admitted that her new boyfriend, Jesus Jeronimo, shot and killed Abraham after he allegedly blackmailed her.
According to her, she did not know that Jesus intended to shoot or kill Abraham. She said she was innocent of that. She was just interested in getting her jewelry back and trying to reconcile maybe and be friends.
But then the plot thickens in this case.
As Angelita's story takes yet another turn, she admits to investigators that it wasn't her jewelry, but a plan concocted by Jesus that brought Abraham out to meet her at a remote location with no witnesses.
So as she's trying to claim this "oh, woe is me," she eventually says that Jesus had her call Abraham to set him up. Tell him that her truck isn't working. They even put the hood of the truck up. He then tells her, "You stay here." Jesus goes and hides. So Angelita waits, and Abraham arrives. So Abraham gets out of the vehicle. Unbeknownst to him, Jesus springs out from his hiding spot.
He's now being confronted by Jesus with the firearm, and that's where he's shot and killed. She admitted to being present when Jesus Jeronimo shot Abraham. She finally tells what happens, but she is making it as if the whole thing was planned by Jesus and that it was his idea.
But Angelita insists she thought the plan was to simply scare Abraham.
She finally ended up throwing Jesus under the bus and blamed him for everything.
She was just very confident that she was fine and there was nothing wrong with what she had done.
It was very apparent that she was so sure she was going to leave that she actually at one point asked them, "So, are you going to pay me for my time?"
While Angelita is held in custody, authorities immediately get Jesus Jeronimo on the phone.
We somewhat did a ruse because we called Jeronimo and we said, "Hey, Angelita's ready to be picked up from the police department. Come and pick her up." So when he showed up to pick her up, that's when we took him under custody.
Once in the interview room, investigators ease into their line of questioning by getting to know the suspect.
During our conversation, he said that he was born in Long Beach, in California. From there, his family ended up moving to Wasco to go work in agriculture. He told me that he had met Angelita about a year ago and that they worked together in Delano.
Jesus really didn't have anybody in this world. He was alone. He didn't have an education. He didn't have anybody to look up to or any type of, positive role models in his life. And Angelita, she stepped in. She was all these things for him.
She taught him how to work. She taught him a lot of skills that he believed were skills that his father should have taught him, but his father never did. So he, was fond of her.
When investigators confront him about the murder of Abraham Gaspar Reyes, Jesus begins to crack under the pressure.
His demeanor, you could tell something was bothering him. And we said, "Well, what did you do?" He went on to say that he was tired of Abraham threatening or intimidating Angelita. Always worried that some photos or video was going to be leaked out to her ex-husband and to her children.
He's like, "I just need it to stop. I need Abraham to stop torturing Angelita."
He said all that weekend, he started thinking about it. He had made his mind up that he was going to kill him. So he ended up speaking with a coworker and said, "Hey, can I borrow a gun?"
He had this friend, Arturo, who was the one who provided the weapon.
He stated that when Arturo got there, Jesus said, "Hey, I don't know how to use a gun." So Jesus said Arturo gave him a tutorial, left him with a loaded gun that Arturo made sure was fully loaded, and said, "Wait, you're still just gonna scare him. You're not gonna do anything else, right?"
Jesus said that he was a very stubborn person, and once that thought went into his mind, there was no convincing him otherwise.
Jesus claimed that he asked Angelita to set a time to meet with Abraham, and Angelita was more than happy to comply.
Jeronimo said they were going to tell Abraham to meet him in Early Mart in the outskirts and say that the car broke down. And he went across the street and hid in a grape vineyard.
And when Abraham arrived, he jumped out of his hiding spot. He said he pepper sprayed Abraham. He held Abraham at gunpoint. and that he drove him nearby to the almond orchard.
He says that as they're walking, he's still covering his face because of the pepper spray. That Abraham tells them, you're not a bad person. I forgive you for what you're about to do. This is not your work. This is the devil's work.
I can't imagine what would be going through someone's mind. You know you're being marched to your death, thinking about the things you don't get to do maybe, the loved ones you're leaving behind.
Jesus goes, I raised a gun, I put it right next to his head, and something in me was telling me, don't do it, you're gonna get in trouble. And he goes, I pulled the trigger.
Tulare County investigators are questioning 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo, who has cracked under the pressure of investigators about the murder of beloved pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes.
Some dam inside him, emotional dam, just broke. And it's kind of that old saying, confession is good for the soul. He spilled everything.
He goes, when I pulled the trigger, I seen him going back. But I didn't want to have that image engraved in my head, so I looked away and I left.
He stated he walked back to the car and he told Angelita basically, it's done. And they drive back to the home of Arturo, give him back the gun. And he says, then we went to get empanadas.
Well, they rolled right into the rest of their day like nothing had ever happened. It just came off as very cold and heartless.
We arrested Jesus and Angelita. My office charged them with murder. Then they were both charged with a special circumstance of lying in wait.
To help build their case against Jesus and Angelita, investigators tracked down the man who provided the murder weapon, 37-year-old Arturo Pampa.
He admitted that Jesus did contact him that afternoon and asked for him to meet down in Early Mark and to bring the gun. Arturo said that every time he had talked to either Angelita or to Jesus, it was just that they needed to scare Abraham so that he would stop trying to torture Angelita with these sex tapes. He said Jesus asked, hey, I need you to show me how to work this. Arturo was somebody who wanted to help, and so he agreed and showed him how to use it.
Arturo says he went home and was visited by the couple later that day.
Arturo then said that later that afternoon, Jesus and Angelita arrived at his home and brought back the gun. That he didn't look at the gun at all, he just put it back in the case in the way that it was given to him and stuck it up on the shelf in his closet. The detectives ask, hey, can we see this? Can you give us this gun? And he pulls out the box.
It was a Desert Eagle 44 Magnum. It was consistent with shell casing located at the scene.
You look at the gun and you look down that barrel. There's apparent bodily matter in it. There's blood, skin. There even appears to be like chunks of little bone. So nothing was done to that gun from the time it was used to kill Abraham till the time it was placed in that box and put up on that shelf. Arturo tries to just kind of minimize his involvement, but they ultimately arrest him.
With Angelita Reyes, Jesus Jeronimo, and Arturo Pampa now in custody, investigators obtain a search warrant for the couple's apartment and cell phones.
Angelita was claiming that Abraham was blackmailing her with a number of photos and sexually explicit videos.
We never located any images that would suggest that happened. We never located anything on social media that says that any of these threats had ever taken place or that there was any indication that he'd done anything like that at all. There was no evidence that Abraham was anything other than a stand-up individual.
Based on Angelita's whole personality and her controlling of Abraham, our belief is that she put Jesus up to it.
Jesus Jeronimo was 22 years old at this time, nearly half the age of Angelita Reyes.
So Is it possible that Jesus could have done it to prove his manliness to Angelita?
We ended up taking Jeronimo's cell phone. And on that cell phone, he had an ongoing conversation in Spanish with Pompa. And it went from, I'm tired of this fool, I want to break him, he's doing this too much and I can't take it anymore, to, hey, can I borrow the gun?
Jesus really did believe that it was Abraham who was harassing her, who was following her. But in essence, it was the opposite. It was Angelita who was after Abraham. It was Angelita who was pursuing Abraham. And this whole time, Jesus was fooled.
She wove this tale of being this damsel in distress, and he wanted to be her knight in shining armor.
There's no denying that she was equally as culpable.
4 days after discovering the body of California pastor Abraham Gaspar Reyes, Tulare County investigators have gathered incriminating data from the cell phones of Abraham's ex-girlfriend, 40-year-old Angelita Reyes, and her new boyfriend, 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo.
We did what we call CDRs, call detail records from cell providers. So we take those call detail records and we have them put into what's called CellHawk. And when they plugged them into that system and they started to map them, you clearly see Angelita and Jesus' cell phones traveling in tandem from Bakersfield.
You see then Angelita and Jesus' phones move that couple of miles to where the almond orchard is, and then leave, presumably to where they went and got those empanadas.
Investigators now have enough to press charges. On May 25, 2016, Angelita Reyes and Jesus Jeronimo are both charged with murder. Their gun runner, Arturo Pampa, is also charged with murder.
In California, if you take part in a homicide, you can be charged the same as everybody else. How much he took part in the actual killing of Abraham is unclear.
The best part of making the arrests on this case, we're getting to go back and tell Mom and Dad that the persons that were responsible for Abraham's death are going to be held accountable.
No le guardé rencor ni le guardé odio, simplemente le dije, pedí, Dios mío, ¿por qué? Pero que Dios lo perdone y que la ley que tiene que hacer lo que van a hacer, justicia, yo no puedo hacer nada.
In July 2018, Angelita Reyes, Jesus Jeronimo, and Arturo Pampa's joint trial gets underway.
What was interesting about this trial is that all three defendants were on trial at the same time. So they were all sitting at the defendant's table at the same time.
In this case, the defense jointly took a strategy. They decided absolutely that Angelita and Arturo were going to testify.
They were trying to show that Abraham did threaten Angelita. He was making her life miserable, but none of that was proven.
Instead, it was Angelita who was the aggressor.
Angelita was extremely jealous. So Abraham was in the process of a divorce, and he was still sending money to Mexico to his wife. And this was something that sent her over the edge.
Prosecutors assert that following their breakup, Angelita used 22-year-old Jesus Jeronimo to settle the score.
Angelita was the mastermind. He had nothing to gain by killing Abraham except to gain Angelita.
She used him and he rose to the bait. It's an unforgivable act, and one that justice demands that they fully pay for.
On July 20th, 2018, a Tulare County jury finds both Angelita Reyes and Jesus Jeronimo guilty of first-degree murder. Arturo Pampa, however, is acquitted of all charges.
Arturo supposedly provided the handgun for this homicide, but he did not pull the trigger. And I think a jury probably felt they didn't know how much Arturo might have taken part in the actual killing, moving of the body, or even luring him to that location. It comes down to the killer couple of Angelita and Jesus, because they're the ones that actually did the killing.
Jesus pulled the trigger, but she set the wheels in motion and essentially laid the trap.
This idea that she's being blackmailed with a sex tape is contrived. It's so she can control Jesus, so that she can get what she wants. Because if she couldn't have Abraham, no one could.
They decided to kill Abraham. They did it in no remorse, no sympathy for him or the family.
Yo no deseo a nadie que pasa los dolores que pasé, porque es un dolor triste. Pero esa es mi felicidad, que está con Dios, que ahí está mejor lugar que acá, que aquí hay mucha maldad en el mundo.
Abraham was a very loving and caring person. He wanted the best for everybody, and I will miss him greatly. He was not.
The night California forgot her name, the streetlights kept burning as if nothing had happened, casting long amber shadows over a quiet neighborhood that would never sleep the same way again, because somewhere between the sound of sprinklers clicking on and a screen door easing shut, a woman vanished, and the silence she left behind would harden into a cold case that refused to die. It was 1996, the kind of year people remember for music and sunshine and the promise of better days. But on this block the air felt heavy, charged, as if the ground itself understood what was about to be buried beneath it. One moment, there was routine, the ordinary rhythm of a weekday evening, neighbors cooking dinner, televisions murmuring behind drawn curtains, dogs barking at nothing in particular, and the next moment there was absence, sharp and sudden, the kind that cuts through a community like broken glass. Her car was still there. Her purse was still there. The lights inside her home were on, and she was gone. By morning, whispers moved faster than the police radios. A missing person, they said. An adult, no obvious signs of struggle. No note, no warning. The front door wasn't forced. The windows were locked. The house looked lived in, paused mid-sentence, a coffee cup on the counter, laundry half-folded, a life interrupted without explanation. Detectives walked the room slowly, carefully, their eyes trained to see what panic had missed, but the scene offered nothing dramatic, nothing loud. No blood, no broken furniture, just a quiet wrongness, a sense that something had been carefully removed. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters, arms crossed, voices low, scanning each other's faces for answers they didn't yet know they were afraid to hear. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was a safe area. Kids rode bikes until dusk. Doors were left unlocked. People trusted each other. Her name echoed through the early reports, printed in bold black letters beneath grainy photos pulled from driver's licenses and family albums. She was described in the language of normalcy. Reliable, friendly, punctual, someone who waved hello, someone who knew schedules, someone who would never just disappear. Friends told police she had plans. Family said she would have called. Coworkers said she hadn't mentioned leaving town. Every detail tightened the knot instead of loosening it. This wasn't a runaway story. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a missing woman, and the clock was already ticking. The first 48 hours passed in a blur of flashing lights and notepads, of search grids drawn on maps, of volunteers combing nearby fields and drainage canals under a sun that felt too bright for the questions being asked. Helicopters thudded overhead. 9 units traced scents that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Detectives knocked on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Who saw her last? Who heard anything unusual? Who noticed a car that didn't belong? Most answers were shrugs, half-memories, fragments that couldn't be stitched into anything solid. One neighbor thought they heard a car late at night. Another remembered a voice, maybe raised, maybe laughing. Nothing held long enough to matter. Then came the interviews, the careful probing of routines and relationships, the slow excavation of a life turned inside out. Friends, family, coworkers, ex-partners, everyone became a potential key, every interaction a possible doorway into the dark. Detectives asked about arguments, about debts, about secrets, about anyone who paid too much attention or asked the wrong questions. The answers piled up, but none of them pointed in a single direction. There was no obvious suspect, no history of violence, no pattern that screamed danger. Just a woman who went missing in a community that couldn't explain how. Local news stations latched onto the story, the words mysterious disappearance sliding easily into headlines. Anchors speaking her name with practiced gravity as footage of police tape looped behind them. The phrase cold case hadn't settled in yet, but hovered there, waiting, growing heavier with each day she didn't come home. Tips poured in at first, phone lines lighting up with calls from people convinced they'd seen her at gas stations, at bus stops, at grocery stores miles away. Each lead sparked a brief flare of hope before fading into disappointment. Sightings couldn't be confirmed. Alibis checked out. Trails went cold. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation shifted from urgency to endurance. Posters faded on telephone poles, their corners curling in the heat. Volunteers stopped coming. Reporters moved on to newer stories. Inside the police department, the case file grew thicker, heavier, a physical reminder of everything they didn't have. Detectives rotated off. New ones rotated in, reading old notes, retracing old steps, asking the same questions with fresh eyes, and finding the same dead ends. The evidence room held a small collection of items tied to her life, cataloged and preserved, waiting for a meaning that never arrived. Rumors filled the gaps facts couldn't. Some said she left willingly, that she'd had enough and decided to start over somewhere far away. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting someone close, someone trusted, someone who knew her routines too well. Names were mentioned in hushed tones at backyard barbecues and over coffee counters, but nothing rose to the level of accusation. In public, everyone mourned together. In private, suspicion bloomed like mold in the corners of familiar rooms. People looked at each other differently now, measuring smiles, weighing friendliness, wondering what might be hidden beneath. Years passed. Technology advanced. New databases were built. Old cases were dusted off and reviewed under modern standards. Her file was reopened more than once, each time with a renewed promise that this might be the moment everything changed. Detectives re-examined evidence with updated techniques, running fingerprints through expanded systems, comparing notes with similar cases across the state. There were moments when it felt close, when a lead seemed promising enough to raise heart rates, but every time, the trail slipped away again, leaving only frustration in its wake. The label finally settled in, heavy and official. Cold case. Two words that sound clinical, but carry the weight of unresolved grief. Cold case means unanswered questions. It means a family frozen in time, waiting for a phone call that never comes. It means anniversaries marked not by celebration, but by absence. Every year, on the date she disappeared, someone would light a candle, leave flowers, speak her name into the quiet, refusing to let her vanish completely. The community remembered too, though the edges of the story blurred, details softening with repetition, the shock dulling, but never fully fading. Inside the department, her case became one of those stories told to new recruits, a reminder that not every mystery ends neatly, that some files follow you home at night. Detectives who worked it spoke about it with a mix of determination and regret, replaying interviews in their heads, wondering if they'd missed something small but crucial. A look held too long, a pause before an answer, a detail dismissed because it didn't fit at the time. Cold cases have a way of haunting the people who chase them, living in the space between what is known and what is suspected. By the late 2000s, the neighborhood had changed. Houses were renovated. New families moved in. Kids who once rode bikes past her driveway were grown now, some with families of their own. The streetlights were newer, brighter, but the memory lingered, embedded in the asphalt, in the stories passed down as cautionary tales. This was where she disappeared, they'd say. This was the house. The silence here felt different. And still no body. No confession. No clear narrative to explain how a woman could be erased from her own life, without leaving a trail behind. The case sat, waiting, its questions stacked like unopened letters. Somewhere in the evidence, in the memories of those who spoke to her last, in the quiet details overlooked by time, the truth remained hidden, patient, untouched by the years piling up around it. The community learned to live with the uncertainty, but it never learned to accept it, because cold cases don't end when the file is closed. They end only when the silence breaks. And in California, long after 1996 faded into history, the silence was still very much alive. The silence didn't just linger, it settled in, thick and uncomfortable, and as the years stacked up, the case began to change shape. No longer a breaking headline, but a low, constant hum beneath daily life, a cold case that refused to fully disappear. Detectives learned quickly that time was not an ally here, that memories softened and hardened in the wrong places, that witnesses who once spoke freely now hesitated, unsure whether what they remembered was real or something they told themselves enough times to believe. The file came out again, not with urgency this time, but with stubborn resolve, a second look driven by the uneasy feeling that something had been standing in plain sight all along. They started where they always did, at the beginning, reconstructing her final day hour by hour, minute by minute, mapping movements against receipts, phone logs, and half-remembered conversations. She had gone to work. She had made a stop at the store. She had spoken to someone on the phone that evening, a call that lasted just long enough to matter. Who was on the other end became a point of fixation, detectives circling the detail like sharks. Phone records were pulled again, this time cross-referenced with newer databases. Older numbers matched to names that hadn't existed in official systems back then. Most led nowhere, deadlines tied to businesses long closed or acquaintances already cleared. But one number lingered, familiar, unremarkable, almost invisible because of how ordinary it seemed. The neighbor, the trusted neighbor, the one who waved from across the yard, who borrowed tools and returned them, who knew the rhythms of the street the way everyone else did. Back in 1996, he had been interviewed briefly, casually, a routine conversation logged and filed without fanfare. He lived close enough to notice things, but close enough that his presence felt normal, expected. He had an alibi, loose but acceptable by the standards of the time. He said he was home. He said he heard nothing. He said he'd seen nothing unusual. And for years, that was enough. As investigators revisited those early interviews, they noticed what they hadn't before, the small inconsistencies that don't raise alarms until context changes. His timeline shifted slightly between statements. A detail added here, omitted there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed deception, but enough to make seasoned detectives pause. In cold cases, pauses matter. They pulled his old interview tapes, listening not just to what he said, but how he said it, the cadence of his voice, the moments where he filled silence with unnecessary explanation. This time, the questions hit differently. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic science quietly rewrote the rules. Evidence once considered useless became valuable again, and the property room, long ignored, suddenly felt like a vault of second chances. Items collected from her home, from her car, from the surrounding area were pulled and re-examined, handled with gloves and hope. Among them, trace materials that in 1996 had been logged and shelved because there was simply nothing to do with them. Now there was. DNA technology had evolved, sensitive enough to read whispers left behind by brief contact. The testing took time, weeks stretching into months, each delay feeding the familiar frustration of waiting without answers. Detectives kept working parallel angles, re-interviewing old witnesses, knocking on doors that hadn't been opened to law enforcement in decades. Some people welcomed them, eager to help, relieved that someone still cared. Others were defensive, irritated, suspicious, tired of being reminded of a past they tried to forget. The neighborhood watched again, older now, quieter, the shock replaced by wary curiosity. Why now, they asked. What had changed? The answer came back from the lab in the form of a report that made the room go quiet. A partial profile, not enough for certainty, but enough to exclude some and implicate others. It didn't match family. It didn't match known associates from work. It sat there, anonymous but present, a fingerprint without a name. Detectives fed it into databases, watching the screen like gamblers waiting for a final card. At first, nothing. Then a hit, indirect, distant, a familial connection that pointed not to a suspect but to a possibility. They followed it carefully, building the case the way cold cases demand, slow and methodical, because time had taught them how fragile these moments could be. The trail led back, inevitably, to the same small circle of people, and once again to the neighbor. He had never left the area. He had aged, changed jobs, raised a family, lived an unremarkable life under the same California sun. To the outside world, he was just another face in the crowd. To detectives, he was becoming something else. They brought him in again, framing it as routine, a chance to clarify old statements in light of new information. He agreed easily, almost eagerly, the confidence of someone who believed they had already beaten the system. The interview room felt smaller this time, the air thicker, the questions sharper. They asked him to walk through that night again, to place himself in time and space with precision he hadn't needed before. He complied, but the story strained under its own weight, details piling up where simplicity would have sufficed. Then came the moment that changed everything, subtle but seismic. They mentioned the DNA, not accusing, just observing, watching his reaction rather than his words. A flicker crossed his face, gone almost instantly, but it was there, a micro-expression caught by trained eyes. He asked questions now, specific ones, too specific. He wanted to know what kind of DNA, how old the sample was, where it had been found. Innocent people rarely ask those questions. Still, nothing moved fast. Cold cases don't explode, they tighten. Detectives, at the same time, doubt gnawed at the edges. Years had passed. Lives had been built on the assumption that this mystery would never be solved. What if they were wrong? What if they were forcing a narrative onto fragments that didn't belong together? Cold cases are graveyards of certainty, and every step forward risks opening old wounds without delivering closure. The detectives knew this. They felt the weight of it in every meeting, every late night spent staring at case files. The community sensed the shift before it was announced. Police cars appeared again. Unmarked vehicles lingered. Whispers started up, cautious at first, then louder, fueled by social media and half-heard conversations. The name of the neighbor surfaced again, not openly, but enough to send a ripple through the block. People looked at his house differently now, measuring the distance between past trust and present suspicion. The shock wasn't just about the possibility of guilt. It was about the realization that evil, if it existed here, had worn a friendly face. As winter approached, the case hovered on the edge of something irreversible. The DNA results were being refined, retested, strengthened. Detectives prepared warrants, not ready to act, but unwilling to be caught unprepared. They rehearsed conversations in their heads, imagined how the next interview might go, how far they could push without tipping their hand. In cold cases, timing is everything. Move too fast, and you spook your suspect. Move too slow, and you lose momentum that may never return. And beneath it all, the absence remained. Her empty chair at family gatherings. Her name spoken in past tense. The cold case was no longer just an old file. It was alive again, breathing, tightening its grip on everyone involved. Somewhere between the lab reports and the interview transcripts, between memory and evidence, the truth was drawing closer, and the silence that had protected it for so long was beginning to crack, just enough to let something dark and dangerous start to show. By the time the third decade brushed against the edges of the case, the investigation had learned how to breathe again, slow and deliberate, like a runner pacing for the final miles, because now every step carried consequence. The lab refined the profile, shaving uncertainty down to something sharp enough to cut, and each update tightened the room where detectives gathered, the hum of fluorescent lights sounding louder than it should, the coffee going cold as eyes stayed on numbers and probabilities that finally began to lean in one direction. This was no longer theory or rumor or the loose gravity of suspicion. This was weight. This was mass. This was a cold case starting to remember its own heat. They rebuilt the timeline with a precision that hadn't been possible before, laying it out across whiteboards and screens, color-coded threads connecting places and people, receipts and calls, movements measured in minutes. Her last confirmed sighting sharpened into focus, the hour narrowing, the window shrinking. A neighbor's porch light flicked on at a time that mattered. A dog barked longer than usual. A car door opened, then closed, too late for coincidence, too early for comfort. Details that once floated free now snapped into place, pulled by the gravity of the DNA. The sample itself became a character in the story, silent but insistent, a whisper from the past that refused to be ignored. It had been recovered from an item no one had paid much attention to in 1996. Something so ordinary it blended into the background of daily life, cataloged and stored because procedure demanded it, not because anyone expected it to speak. Now it did. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough. Enough to say someone had been there. Enough to say contact had been made. Enough to say this disappearance had not been clean, not accidental, not voluntary. Detectives widened the net, careful not to let the case collapse inward too quickly. They didn't want tunnel vision. They'd seen what that could do, how it could turn a promising investigation into a tragedy of its own. So they tested alternatives, running the DNA against every plausible scenario, every known associate, every potential suspect who had drifted through the margins over the years. The results came back the same each time, doors closing one by one, leaving fewer places for the truth to hide. The neighbor felt the pressure now, even if no one had said his name out loud. Pressure has a way of leaking through cracks, of showing up in behavior before it ever reaches a courtroom. He became more guarded, less available. His routine shifted subtly, trips timed differently, conversations shorter. Friends noticed. Family noticed. He explained it away as stress, as work, as life, the same excuses everyone uses when the walls start moving inward. But detectives noticed too, and they noted everything, because cold cases reward patience and punish assumptions. They went back to the house, the one where it all started, not as first responders this time, but as archaeologists of violence, scanning familiar rooms with new tools and new eyes. Luminol bloomed faintly in places it shouldn't have, not enough to scream bloodshed, but enough to suggest cleaning, careful and incomplete. They documented it all, photographs stacking up like evidence bricks, each one adding to a structure that was finally beginning to stand on its own. Another interview was scheduled, not confrontational, not yet, framed as cooperation, as clarity, as a chance to help close a chapter that had been open too long. The neighbor arrived calm, practiced, his body language relaxed in ways that felt rehearsed. He smiled at the wrong moments. He nodded too often. He spoke in full sentences when a yes or no would have done. Detectives let him talk. Silence is a powerful tool, and they used it, watching how he filled it, watching where his eyes went when questions brushed against sensitive edges. They asked about that night again, about sounds, about lights, about the rhythm of the street. This time, his answers came faster, smoother, as if he'd been waiting for the chance to deliver them. But speed can betray certainty, and certainty can crack under pressure. He contradicted an earlier statement without realizing it, shifting a timeline by 15 minutes, then correcting himself, then overcorrecting, digging deeper into a hole that had been waiting for him for years. When they introduced the enhanced DNA results, not as accusation, but as fact, the temperature in the room dropped. He leaned back. He crossed his arms. He asked for specifics again. He wanted to know how reliable it was, how contamination was ruled out, how something so old could still matter. The detectives answered calmly, professionally, letting the science speak, letting the inevitability of it sink in. They didn't need a confession yet. They needed to see how fear moved through him. Outside the interview room, the case team worked in parallel, tightening every bolt. Warrants were drafted, revised, held, then revised again. Prosecutors weighed in, cautious, demanding rigor, reminding everyone that cold cases don't get second chances in court. Evidence had to be clean. Motive had to be plausible. Opportunity had to be undeniable. The neighbor's life was dissected quietly. Finances, relationships, moments of stress that coincided with the disappearance. An argument surfaced, one dismissed years ago as trivial, now reinterpreted through a darker lens. Access became a key word, proximity another. The community felt it building, the way animals sense weather before it breaks. Conversations hushed when police cruisers rolled by. Social media buzzed with speculation, posts hedged with disclaimers and fear. Some defended the neighbor fiercely, clinging to decades of familiarity as proof of innocence. Others pulled away, replaying old interactions in their heads, searching for signs they might have missed. Trust, once fractured, doesn't shatter cleanly. It splinters, leaving sharp edges everywhere. For the family, the movement was both relief and terror, hope tangled with dread. They had lived with not knowing for so long that the idea of answers felt unreal, dangerous even. What if the truth was worse than the silence? What if closure came with images they could never unsee? They were informed carefully, kept at a distance, but no longer in the dark. The cold case that had defined so much of their lives was changing temperature. And change, even welcome change, can burn. The DNA profile was pushed further, refined until probabilities turned into near certainties. Statistical language gave way to plain meaning. The odds were astronomical. The chance of coincidence, microscopic. The sample belonged to someone who had no innocent reason to be there. Someone who had been close enough to touch, close enough to leave a trace, close enough to erase a person from her own life and walk back across the street as if nothing had happened. The decision point arrived quietly, without drama, the way the most important moments often do. A meeting, a nod, a stack of papers signed. The warrant was ready, not executed yet, but alive, waiting. Detectives knew that once they crossed that line, there was no going back, no easing off, no retreat into uncertainty. Cold cases end not with fireworks, but with doors closing, with choices made under the weight of everything that came before. As night fell on the neighborhood, once again, decades after the streetlights first cast their long shadows, unmarked cars settled into position, engines ticking softly as they cooled. The house across the way glowed warm from within, ordinary, domestic, a picture of normalcy that felt obscene in its calm. Somewhere inside, the neighbor moved through his evening routine, unaware or pretending to be, while the past pressed in from all sides. The cold case had not yet spoken its final word, but it was done waiting. The silence that had protected the truth for so long was thinning, stretched almost transparent, and through it, the shape of what really happened in California in 1996 was finally beginning to show, dark and unmistakable, ready to step into the light whether anyone was prepared for it or not. The knock came without drama, firm but controlled, the kind that carries authority without needing to announce it. And when the door opened, the ordinary life inside that house collided head-on with the weight of 26 years of unanswered questions. The neighbor's face registered surprise first, then calculation, a flicker of recognition that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by polite confusion, the practiced mask of a man who believed he still understood the rules of this game. Detectives introduced themselves calmly, their voices even, their posture relaxed, and handed him the warrant like a document from another era, something heavy enough to bend time back toward 1996. Inside, the house smelled like dinner and detergent, like nothing was wrong, like nothing had ever been wrong, and that was the most unsettling part. Normalcy has a way of mocking the past, of daring it to prove it mattered. They moved through the rooms slowly, methodically, cataloging, photographing, documenting, their attention drawn not just to what was there, but to what felt out of place. Storage boxes in the garage, old tools wrapped in rags, a section of the yard where soil looked different, disturbed long ago and then forgotten. Each detail was a whisper, not yet an accusation, but the house was talking now, whether its owner wanted it to or not. The neighbor sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, watching the process with forced patience. He cracked jokes that landed poorly. He asked procedural questions, the kind that sounded cooperative but edged toward defensive. Detectives answered what they could, deflected what they couldn't, letting the tension stretch, because tension reveals things truth tries to hide. Every so often his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the back door, toward spaces that suddenly seemed too small to contain the past pressing in on them. Evidence bags filled slowly. Soil samples, fibers, items that had survived decades of moves and cleanings because no one ever thought they would matter. Cold cases thrive on what people forget to throw away. In the garage, beneath years of dust, they found an old cooler, brittle with age, its latch cracked but intact. It was logged, photographed, removed. No conclusions drawn yet. Just another piece. Just another question. At the station, the interrogation resumed, no longer framed as routine, no longer softened by the fiction of clarification. This time the room felt tighter, the air heavier, the stakes unmistakable. The neighbor was informed of his rights. He nodded. He smiled thinly. He said he understood. And then the questions began again, not as repetition, but as confrontation, each one anchored to evidence, each one closing space he'd once used to maneuver. They laid out the timeline. The porch light, the barking dog, the car door. They presented his own words back to him, transcripts from decades apart, the contradictions underlined, not in ink, but in implication. He shifted in his chair now, irritation bleeding through the calm, the mask slipping just enough to show the strain beneath. He insisted they were mistaken. He insisted memory was unreliable. He insisted on coincidence. Cold cases are built on insisting, and detectives know how to let that rope unspool. Then the DNA came back into the room, no longer a concept but a conclusion. The refined profile, the statistical certainty, the near impossibility of error. They didn't dramatize it. They didn't raise their voices. They simply placed the facts on the table and let gravity do the work. The neighbor stared at the papers longer than necessary, as if reading them hard enough might change what they said. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter, stripped of humor, edged with something raw. He offered explanations now, speculative, implausible, grasping for distance. Maybe contamination, maybe secondary transfer. Maybe she'd brushed against him earlier that week. Detectives listened, asked follow-ups, let the explanations tangle themselves. Each theory required more assumptions than the last, more unlikely coincidences, until the weight of them collapsed inward. Silence stretched again, thick and oppressive, and in that silence the past felt close enough to touch. Hours passed. Breaks were taken. Water was offered. Lawyers were requested, consulted, withdrawn. The dance continued, careful and precise, because one misstep could poison everything. Outside the room, lab results from the search were trickling in. Fibers matched. Soil composition aligned disturbingly well with a remote area just outside town, a place once searched but dismissed because nothing obvious had been found. Technology doesn't just find new answers. It reinterprets old failures. The warren expanded. Another search, another location. This time the ground told a clearer story. Cadaver dogs alerted. Excavation followed. And beneath layers of earth and time, they found what the silence had been hiding. Remains fragile, incomplete, but unmistakably human. The air at the site felt heavier, charged with a grief that had been waiting decades for permission to surface. Forensic teams worked carefully, reverently, every movement deliberate, every find documented, because this wasn't just evidence, it was a person coming back into the world. Confirmation took time. Science always does. But the family was notified before the final reports were signed, because there are moments when certainty lives in the heart before it ever reaches paper. They gathered, older now, lined with years of waiting, and listened as words they'd imagined 1,000 times finally took shape. She had been found. Not alive, but found. The cold case had given up its most guarded secret, and the relief was sharp enough to hurt. The neighbor was arrested quietly, without spectacle, without the chaos that once would have surrounded such a moment. There were no flashing lights for the cameras, no shouted questions, just the click of cuffs and the closing of a car door. He stared straight ahead as he was led away, his face a study in controlled collapse. A man watching the story he thought he'd buried rise up to claim him. Across the street, curtains shifted. People watched. Some cried. Some shook their heads. No one spoke. In court filings, the language was clinical, precise, stripped of emotion, but the story beneath it was anything but. Proximity, opportunity, motive inferred from jealousy, from entitlement, from a moment where control was lost and then violently reclaimed. The trusted neighbor narrative inverted completely, trust curdling into betrayal, familiarity into camouflage. The community reeled, grappling not just with what had happened, but with how easily it had been hidden in plain sight. As the case moved forward, old footage resurfaced, interviews replayed, headlines rewritten. The phrase cold case solved slid into broadcasts with a finality that felt almost unreal. Solved suggested neatness, resolution, and ending. But nothing about this felt neat. The years were still gone. The damage still done. Closure, if it existed at all, was complicated, fractured, arriving hand in hand with anger and regret. For detectives, there was satisfaction, yes, but also exhaustion, a deep, bone-level weariness that comes from carrying someone else's unanswered questions for too long. They reviewed the case one last time, not to second-guess, but to understand, to learn where it had stalled, where it had waited for a future that finally arrived. Cold cases are lessons written in time, reminders that patience can be as powerful as speed, that silence can be broken even after decades of holding firm. The neighborhood would never fully recover its innocence. Every wave from across a yard, every borrowed tool, every casual hello now carried an echo of doubt. Trust, once broken at that scale, doesn't rebuild easily. People locked their doors more often. They paid closer attention. They told their children stories about the past, not to scare them, but to warn them that monsters don't always look like monsters, and safety is sometimes just a story we tell ourselves until it isn't. As the sun set on another California evening, the streetlights came on again, brighter now, cleaner, but casting the same long shadows they always had. The cold case that began in that glow had finally spoken, its voice rough from disuse but undeniable. Yet even with arrests made and answers found, the echo remained, a reminder that some silences change us forever, and that even when a mystery is solved, the shock of what it reveals can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the moment it finally comes into the light. The case didn't slow after the arrest. It sharpened, edges grinding closer together as the machinery of justice began to turn, loud and unforgiving, dragging every buried detail into open air. Evidence moved from sealed bags to illuminated screens, from whispers in hallways to sworn statements under oath, and the story that had once lived only in absence now demanded structure, demanded to be told in a language courts could understand. For the first time since 1996, the past had a calendar again, dates circled not in hope but in consequence. Forensic confirmation arrived in layers, careful and methodical, each report stacking atop the last like bricks in a wall that could no longer be pushed aside. Dental records aligned. Bone analysis spoke quietly but clearly. The remains were hers. There was no ambiguity left to soften the truth. The family heard it in a room that felt too small for the weight of the moment, a room where tears came not as a rush, but as a steady release, grief finally given permission to breathe. They had lived with not knowing for so long that knowing felt like a second shock, a different kind of impact, one that rearranged memory and pain all at once. The prosecution built its case without theatrics, aware that time itself was the most dramatic witness they had. They laid out proximity and opportunity, motive inferred not from a single explosive moment, but from a pattern, a slow burn of fixation and entitlement that had never been loud enough to draw attention until it turned catastrophic. The DNA anchored everything, a silent thread tying scenes and years together. But it was the accumulation that made it undeniable. The porch light, the barking dog, the soil, the fibers, the inconsistencies. Cold cases don't hinge on one revelation. They crystallize when enough small truths lock into place. The defense countered predictably, attacking the age of the evidence, the fallibility of memory, the danger of confirmation bias in cases revived after decades. They spoke of contamination and coincidence, of tunnel vision and hindsight, trying to reintroduce doubt into a narrative that had hardened against it. They painted a picture of a man swallowed by a story that had outgrown its facts. A neighbor turned suspect because he was convenient, familiar, too close to escape scrutiny. It was a strategy as old as the system itself, and it landed with some, but not many. Media coverage surged again, louder than it had ever been in the 90s, amplified by the speed and reach of modern platforms. Headlines recycled the phrase "cold case solved," flashing it across screens with a confidence that felt almost celebratory, as if resolution were a prize rather than a reckoning. Archival footage played beside fresh interviews. Old photos were sharpened, color-corrected, framed anew. The victim's name trended, rose, fell, and rose again, pulled into the current of a news cycle that demanded updates, demanded angles, demanded something to fill the space between court dates. The community watched itself being reflected back through that lens and didn't always like what it saw. Neighbors recognized their own faces in old B-roll, younger, unaware, standing behind police tape that now seemed impossibly thin. They remembered what they'd said then, what they'd assumed, what they'd dismissed. Guilt surfaced in quiet ways, in the second-guessing of moments that might have mattered, of instincts ignored because it was easier to believe nothing was wrong. The idea that the truth had lived across the street all that time pressed down hard, reshaping memories into something heavier. Inside the courtroom, the tone was restrained, procedural, almost subdued, because spectacle was unnecessary. The facts carried enough force on their own. Jurors listened as timelines were rebuilt, as maps lit up with movements traced backward through years, as experts explained probabilities in plain language until the abstract became personal. The neighbor sat at the defense table, older now, smaller somehow, his confidence eroded by repetition and exposure. He avoided eye contact. He took notes he would never read. The mask that had served him so well had nothing left to cling to. Witnesses took the stand and spoke of ordinary interactions that now felt ominous in retrospect. A borrowed ladder, a conversation that lingered too long, a look that didn't quite fit. None of it proved guilt alone, but together it painted a picture of access, of familiarity used as cover. Detectives testified too, careful not to editorialize, walking the jury through the evolution of the investigation, explaining why the case had stalled and why it had moved again. They spoke of technology catching up to truth, of patience rewarded not with triumph, but with responsibility. The family sat together, absorbing each detail, their expressions a shifting landscape of sorrow, anger, and something like relief. They had imagined this room for years, imagined what it would feel like to hear the story told out loud, to have their private grief translated into public record. Some moments cut deeper than expected. Others passed strangely numb. Closure, they realized, wasn't a door you walked through once. It was a series of thresholds, each one asking something different of you. Outside the courthouse, the world kept spinning, indifferent in its motion. People went to work. Kids went to school. Traffic moved. The contrast felt jarring, a reminder that even the most devastating truths occupy only a slice of time and space. For those inside the case, though, everything felt suspended, stretched thin between what had been and what would follow. Sentencing loomed like a distant landmark, visible but not yet reached, its shape altering expectations with every step closer. When a verdict came, it did so without flourish, delivered in a voice that carried the weight of finality without emotion. Guilty. The word landed and stayed, echoing in a room that had held its breath for too long. The neighbor didn't react at first. Then his shoulders sagged just slightly, as if acknowledging a gravity he could no longer resist. The family cried. Some jurors did too. No one celebrated. Justice, when it arrives this late, is complicated, tangled with everything it couldn't give back. Sentencing followed weeks later, the language precise, the outcome inevitable. Decades of freedom were accounted for, weighed against the finality of what he had taken. The judge spoke of accountability and harm, of the long shadow cast by violence that hides behind familiarity. The sentence was severe, fitting not just the crime, but the years of silence that followed it. As he was led away, the room felt quieter, emptier, as if something had finally been released. In the aftermath, life didn't return to normal because normal had been redefined. The house across the street sold. New people moved in, unaware at first, then informed gently, cautiously, as if the truth might break something fragile if handled too roughly. Memorials were updated. A headstone finally bore dates that made sense, even if nothing else did. The family found ways to remember her that weren't anchored solely to loss. Reclaiming stories that existed before the disappearance rewrote everything. For the detectives, the case closed on paper, but not in practice. Cold cases leave residue, lessons that linger in how questions are asked, in how assumptions are challenged, in how patience is valued. They spoke about it less over time, but when they did, there was a shared understanding, a recognition of what it had cost and what it had given. Not victory, not peace, something closer to completion. And in the community, the echoes persisted, subtle but present. People waved a little less casually. They paid attention a little more. They taught their children that danger doesn't always announce itself, that trust is precious and fragile. The streetlights still came on each night, steady and bright, casting shadows that looked just like they always had, but everyone knew now how much could hide within them. The cold case that began with a vanished woman in a quiet street had ended with answers, but answers didn't erase the years in between. They sat alongside them, inseparable, a reminder that time can bury truth but not destroy it, that silence can protect guilt for a while but not forever. And long after the headlines faded again, long after the courtroom emptied, the story remained, etched into memory, a testament to the unsettling fact that sometimes the most shocking revelations aren't about strangers at all, but about the familiar faces we thought we knew. The sentence didn't end the story. It changed its temperature, cooling the roar of the courtroom into a quieter, more persistent hum that followed everyone back into their lives. Justice had spoken, but justice doesn't tuck itself in and go to sleep. It lingers. It asks to be carried. In the weeks after sentencing, the case began to echo in unexpected places, surfacing in conversations that started about something else entirely, in pauses that stretched a little longer than they used to, in the way people listened when someone said the word neighbor. The family returned to a house that had learned how to hold grief without complaint. They sorted through boxes they'd avoided for years, items saved because throwing them away felt like erasure. Letters, photos, small objects that still carried the shape of her hands. The difference now was subtle but profound. The future tense was gone. There would be no sudden call, no miraculous return, no suspended hope vibrating beneath everything else. The truth had drawn a hard line through time, separating before from after, and in that clarity there was pain, but also a strange steadiness. Knowing at last gave their grief a place to stand. They spoke to the media once more, carefully, choosing words that honored her life without feeding the spectacle that still clung to the case. They corrected details. They pushed back against myths. They refused to let her be remembered only as a victim or a headline. She had laughed. She had plans. She had habits that annoyed people who loved her. The cold case had solved itself into facts, but memory demanded something warmer, something human. That became their quiet mission, reclaiming her from the machinery that had finally, belatedly, told the truth. For the detectives, the come-down was real. After years of tension, of nights spent chasing probabilities and ghosts, the sudden absence of pursuit felt disorienting. The case file was closed, archived, but it lived on in muscle memory, in the instinct to double-check a detail, to question a narrative that fit too neatly. They returned to other work, Other victims, other families suspended in uncertainty, carrying with them the lessons this case had burned into them. Trust nothing blindly. Preserve everything. Time is not an enemy if you respect it. The department conducted a quiet internal review, not to assign blame, but to understand. Why had the case stalled when it did? What had been missing in 1996 that existed now? The answers were uncomfortable and instructive. Technology had been one barrier, yes, but complacency had been another. Familiarity. The assumption that danger announces itself from the outside, that it looks different, that it wears a face we can recognize as threat. Cold cases expose not just crimes, but the blind spots that allow them to persist. Training protocols were updated. Evidence retention policies tightened. Old cases were flagged for review with fresh eyes, not because every silence hides a monster, but because some do, and the cost of ignoring that possibility is too high. Younger officers listened intently when the story was told, absorbing the details not as legend, but as warning. This is how it happens, they were told. This is how it hides. Pay attention. The community moved through its own reckoning. Town halls were held, ostensibly about safety and awareness, but really about trust and how easily it fractures. People spoke about how the arrest had made them reevaluate their assumptions, how it had forced them to look backward and question moments they dismissed. There was anger, yes, directed at the man who had lived among them, carrying a secret that had reshaped so many lives. But there was also a quieter anger, harder to place, aimed inward at the collective comfort that had made it easier not to see. The house changed hands again. Fresh paint, new landscaping. A family who didn't know the full story at first, then learned it in fragments, the way everyone does. They debated whether to stay, whether walls could be cleansed of what they'd witnessed, whether geography could be separated from history. In the end, they stayed, choosing to live forward rather than retreat, a small act of defiance against the idea that violence gets to claim territory forever. Journalists circled back months later, looking for follow-ups, for angles that could extend the life of a story that had already burned hot and fast. Some asked about remorse. Others asked about warning signs. A few asked the questions that mattered, about how communities can do better, about what it means to live with uncertainty and still choose connection over suspicion. The answers were imperfect, but they were honest. There are no guarantees, only attention, only care. The term cold case took on a different weight now, less abstract, more personal. It was no longer just a label for an old file. It was a reminder that time doesn't neutralize harm, it only delays its accounting. People who had followed the story from afar felt it too. A flicker of unease at the realization that resolution can arrive decades late, that truth doesn't age out of relevance, that the past is patient. The story became a reference point, cited in discussions about forensic advances, about investigative persistence, about the ethics of revisiting old wounds in pursuit of justice. For the family, anniversaries shifted. The date she disappeared no longer stood alone. It was joined by the date she was found, the date of the verdict, the date of sentencing. Each carried its own gravity, its own emotional weather. They marked them quietly, sometimes together, sometimes alone, learning that grief doesn't move in a straight line even when the facts finally do. They found moments of peace in unexpected places, in laughter that surprised them, in the knowledge that her story had not ended in silence. The convicted man disappeared into the system, his name slowly fading from headlines, replaced by numbers and schedules and the slow erosion of notoriety. In prison, he became what he had always tried not to be in public. Unremarkable, one among many, stripped of the ordinary camouflage that had protected him for so long. There were no dramatic confessions, no last-minute revelations that rewrote the narrative. The truth had already been told as fully as it ever would be, and what remained was consequence. Years later, the case would be revisited in documentaries and podcasts, retold with the benefit of distance and the temptation of drama. Some accounts would get it right. Others would smooth edges or exaggerate moments for effect. The family learned to live with that too, correcting when necessary, letting go when correction would cost too much. Stories once released have lives of their own. Control is an illusion. What matters is the core, the part that resists distortion. A woman mattered, she was taken, and the truth eventually found its way back. In quieter moments, detectives sometimes wondered what would have happened if one question had been asked differently in 1996, if one assumption had been challenged sooner. Those thoughts came and went, acknowledged but not indulged. Regret is easy in hindsight, but it doesn't change outcomes. What changes outcomes is what you do next, how you apply the weight of what you've learned. That, more than the arrest or the sentence, was the real legacy of the case. The neighborhood settled into a new equilibrium, not the innocence it once had, but something more grounded, more alert. People still borrowed tools. They still waved. But there was a shared understanding now that familiarity is not immunity, that vigilance doesn't have to mean fear, that looking out for one another requires more than assumptions. It requires attention. It requires listening when something feels off, even if you can't yet explain why. On some evenings, when the light hit the street just right, the past felt close again, not as an open wound, but as a presence, a reminder. The streetlights flickered on, steady and reliable, casting shadows that no longer seemed mysterious, just honest. The cold case had ended, but its echo continued, not as a warning screamed into the night, but as a low, steady voice saying this can happen. This did happen, and what you do with that knowledge is what determines whether the silence stays broken. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It pressed forward, indifferent, sanding the sharpest edges of shock into something quieter, but no less real. And as years passed, the case slipped out of daily conversation and into the deeper layers of memory, where things are carried rather than discussed. Yet it never vanished completely. It lingered in the way people told the story to newcomers, not with drama anymore, but with a gravity that made them lower their voices, as if the truth itself demanded respect. This wasn't just something that happened once. It was something that had lived among them, undetected, and that knowledge never fully loosened its grip. The family learned how to live with a past that now had an ending. They traveled to places they had postponed for decades, places that once felt impossible to visit because leaving felt like tempting fate. They laughed more freely, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer had to compete with uncertainty. Grief had shape now. It had boundaries. Some days it was heavy. Some days it was manageable. On rare days, it felt almost gentle, like a memory that hurt but didn't wound. They spoke her name without flinching, told stories that weren't anchored to the disappearance, and in doing so, reclaimed parts of her life that had been overshadowed for too long. For law enforcement beyond the town, the case became a touchstone, cited in training seminars and investigative conferences as an example of how patience and evolving science can converge. Slides showed timelines stretched across decades, graphs illustrating how probability had turned into certainty. But the most important lessons weren't on the screens. They were in the questions asked afterward. How many other cases like this exist? How many answers are waiting in evidence rooms, cataloged but unheard? The story sparked renewed interest in old files, prompting departments to take another look at cases that had been written off not because they were unsolvable, but because the tools hadn't existed yet. Families of other missing persons watched closely, hope flickering and flaring in complicated ways. Some reached out, asking what it had been like, what to expect if their own cases ever moved again. The answers were honest, tempered, careful not to promise what couldn't be guaranteed. Resolution doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it hurts in new ways, but it ends the waiting, and that, they said, mattered more than they had understood at the beginning. The cold case had become a signal, a reminder that silence is not the same as absence, that time can be a barrier, but not a verdict. The convicted man receded further into obscurity, his appeals exhausted, his name reduced to a line in a database, a reference in footnotes and legal summaries. He did not become a symbol of evil so much as a study in banality, a person who had blended in so completely that his capacity for harm went unnoticed. Psychologists analyzed the case, not to excuse, but to understand, to identify the patterns that allow such individuals to operate undetected. The conclusions were unsettling in their simplicity. Familiarity breeds assumption. Assumption breeds blindness, and blindness creates space. The house where it had begun continued to stand, altered but intact, absorbing new lives and new routines. Children played in the yard again. Music drifted through open windows. The past did not announce itself, did not intrude unless invited. Yet there were moments, quiet ones, when the weight of history felt close, when the ground seemed to remember even if the people tried not to. The idea that places hold memory became less abstract, more tangible, a sensation rather than a belief. Media interest tapered off, then surged again with anniversaries, with true crime retrospectives hungry for content. Each retelling shifted the emphasis slightly, some focusing on the forensic triumph, others on the shock of betrayal. The family learned to discern which stories honored the truth and which merely used it. They participated selectively, turning down requests that felt invasive, accepting those that centered the human cost rather than the spectacle. The case had taught them the price of attention, and they guarded what little peace they had earned. Within the community, the case subtly rewired how people related to one another. Neighborhood watch programs evolved, less about suspicion and more about awareness. People checked in more often, noticed changes, trusted instincts they might once have dismissed as overreaction. There was a collective understanding that safety is not a static condition, but an ongoing practice, something maintained through engagement rather than assumed through familiarity. The disappearance that had once shattered their sense of security had, paradoxically, left them more connected, more attuned to one another. Detectives who had worked the case aged into retirement, carrying its lessons into quieter lives. Some kept a copy of the case file, not out of obsession, but out of respect, of a reminder of why the work mattered even when it seemed futile. They spoke about it rarely, but when they did, it was with a tone reserved for things that had changed them. Cold cases, they said, teach you humility. They teach you that answers don't always arrive on your schedule, and that persistence is as much about faith as it is about effort. The broader public absorbed the story into a growing awareness of how fragile certainty can be. It fueled debates about evidence preservation, about funding for forensic labs, about the ethics of revisiting trauma long after the fact. Some argued that reopening old wounds served no purpose. Others pointed to this case as proof that truth, no matter how delayed, has value. The discussions were complex, unresolved, mirroring the nature of justice itself. There were no easy conclusions, only a shared recognition that time does not diminish responsibility. On the anniversary of the arrest, a small group gathered quietly near the place where she had last been seen. There were no cameras, no speeches, just people standing together, acknowledging what had been lost and what had been found. The air was still. The moment passed without ceremony, but it mattered. Rituals don't need audiences to be real. Sometimes they are simply a way of marking that something ended and something else began. As technology continued to advance, the case remained a reference point, a benchmark against which new possibilities were measured. Techniques that once seemed revolutionary became standard. What had been impossible in 1996 was now routine. This progress carried a strange duality. Hope for the future paired with a quiet grief for all the years when answers were out of reach. The cold case had been solved, but it also stood as a reminder of how many others remained suspended, waiting for their moment to speak. For those who had lived closest to the truth, the story never truly ended. It transformed, becoming part of how they understood the world, how they interpreted trust and risk and resilience. It informed the way they raised children, the advice they gave friends, the choices they made about who to let close. Trauma doesn't vanish, it integrates. And in that integration, there's both loss and growth. Some nights, when the street was quiet and the light fell just right, the past felt close enough to touch, not as a threat, but as a presence. The memory of what had been hidden there served as a quiet caution, not screamed but whispered, reminding anyone who listened that truth can be patient, that it can wait years to be heard, but that it does not forget. The cold case had ended on paper, yes, but in the lives it had touched, it continued to ripple outward, shaping understanding in ways that would never fully be seen. And perhaps that was its final legacy, not the arrest or the sentence or the headlines, but the enduring awareness it left behind, the knowledge that beneath the ordinary surface of daily life, stories are unfolding that demand attention, compassion, and courage. The silence had been broken once. The challenge now was to remember how easily it had formed, and to never again mistake quiet for safety or familiarity for innocence, in a world where the past is always closer than it appears. The story kept breathing long after most people assumed it was finished, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the slow, persistent way certain truths refused to stay confined to their final chapter. It surfaced in classrooms where criminal justice students debated investigative failures and breakthroughs, in late-night conversations where someone would mention the case as an example of how wrong first impressions can be, and in quiet moments when people replayed ordinary interactions, wondering what else might be hidden behind familiar smiles. The cold case had been solved, yes, but its presence lingered like a low-frequency hum beneath modern life. For the family, the years following resolution brought a new kind of work, one that required intention rather than endurance. They had spent decades surviving uncertainty. Now, they had to learn how to live with certainty. That shift was more destabilizing than they expected. Answers didn't arrive as a clean replacement for hope. They arrived tangled with images and facts that demanded processing. Therapy became less about coping with absence and more about integrating knowledge. They discovered that closure wasn't a finish line, but a process, uneven and unpredictable, marked by setbacks and moments of unexpected calm. They began to support other families navigating unresolved cases, not as experts, but as witnesses to what prolonged uncertainty can do. They listened more than they spoke. When they did speak, they avoided promises. Every case is different, they said. Every silence has its own weight. But they also spoke of persistence, of the importance of preserving evidence, of advocating for continued attention even when the world has moved on. Their experience lent credibility to a truth many already knew but struggled to articulate. Waiting is its own form of trauma. The case continued to influence policy in small but meaningful ways. Grants were approved to test old evidence. Task forces were expanded. Databases were merged and made more accessible across jurisdictions. None of it made headlines. None of it felt cinematic, but together it represented progress built on lessons learned the hard way. The past had forced the present to adapt, and that adaptation quietly increased the odds that other silences might one day be broken. True crime culture, still hungry, folded the case into its ever-growing archive. Some storytellers approached it with care, framing it as a meditation on time and accountability rather than a spectacle of violence. Others reduced it to plot points, focusing on the twist of the trusted neighbor, the shock value of betrayal. The difference mattered. The family noticed. So did others. Discussions emerged about ethics, about responsibility, about who owns a story once it enters public consciousness. The case became a reference not just for investigators, but for creators wrestling with the line between awareness and exploitation. The neighborhood itself changed in ways that were almost imperceptible. New residents arrived who knew the story only vaguely, if at all. Older residents carried it differently now, less as a source of fear and more as a lesson etched into experience. They were quicker to intervene when something fell off, quicker to check in, quicker to trust their instincts. The disappearance had once fractured their sense of safety. Its resolution reshaped it into something more deliberate, less naive. Security was no longer assumed. It was practiced. Children who grew up hearing fragments of the story absorbed its meaning in their own way. For them, it was a cautionary tale woven into everyday advice. Stay aware, speak up, look out for each other. It didn't make them fearful. If anything, it made them attentive. They learned early that danger doesn't always announce itself, that harm can coexist with normalcy, and that silence could be a warning sign rather than a reassurance. The detectives, now years removed from the intensity of the investigation, found the case resurfacing in unexpected moments. A new cold case crossing their desk would trigger memories, not of frustration, but of patience. They knew better now than to dismiss a file because it was old, better than to assume that what couldn't be solved immediately never would be. The case had rewired their instincts, sharpening their skepticism and deepening their respect for evidence that waits quietly for its moment. Retirement brought space for reflection. Some detectives revisited the case privately, rereading notes with a gentler eye, no longer searching for mistakes, but for understanding. They accepted that the tools available at the time had shaped the outcome. That judgment without context serves no one. What mattered was that the truth had eventually been pursued with integrity, and that the pursuit had honored the victim rather than the clock. The man convicted of the crime faded further into institutional anonymity. He became a statistic, a cautionary example referenced in academic papers and legal discussions, stripped of the ordinariness that had once shielded him. There were no revelations waiting in the wings, no dramatic confessions to rewrite the narrative. His silence, now contained, held no power. The story had moved past him, centering instead on what had been lost and what had been learned. As forensic science continued to evolve, the case gained a strange dual status, both resolved and unfinished. Resolved in the sense that accountability had been established, unfinished in the sense that its implications continued to unfold. Each technological breakthrough prompted the same question: what else is waiting? How many answers are locked inside evidence rooms, dormant only because the present hasn't yet caught up to the past? The case became a benchmark, a reminder that patience and progress often move on different timelines. Public memory shifted too. The shock that once defined the story softened into something more contemplative. People remembered it not just for the betrayal, but for the endurance, for the way a community and a family had carried uncertainty without letting it erase connection. It became a story about time as much as crime, about the long arc between harm and accountability, and the people who live inside that arc. On certain anniversaries, small gestures marked the passage of years. Flowers left quietly, notes written and tucked away, moments of silence observed without announcement. These acts didn't seek closure. They acknowledged continuity. The past remained part of the present, not as a threat, but as context. Remembering became less about pain and more about responsibility, a commitment to vigilance and compassion shaped by experience. The street where it all began continued to look ordinary, almost defiantly so. Cars parked along the curb, lawns trimmed, lights turning on at dusk. To someone passing through, it was just another California neighborhood, unremarkable and calm. But beneath that calm lived a shared understanding, invisible but enduring, that safety is not guaranteed by appearance, and that awareness is a form of care. As years layered themselves over the events of 1996, the case resisted becoming just history. It stayed relevant, not because of its drama, but because of its implications. It asked uncomfortable questions about how well we know the people around us, about how easily routine can mask harm, and about what we owe to those who disappear into silence. It reminded anyone willing to listen that truth doesn't rush, and that justice, when it arrives, often brings complexity rather than relief. The cold case had given up its secrets, but it had also left behind a responsibility, one shared by everyone who knew the story. To remember without sensationalizing, to remain alert without becoming suspicious, to honor the past without being trapped by it. In that balance, the story found its final rhythm, not an ending, but a continuation, carried forward quietly in the choices people made, the questions they asked, and the attention they paid to the spaces where silence once grew too comfortably. The passage of time softened the public's voice around the case, but it sharpened its meaning distilling years of noise into a quieter understanding that some stories don't end so much as they settle into the bedrock of a place. The case stopped being something people reacted to and became something they carried, a reference point that shaped how they interpreted risk, trust, and a thin line between ordinary life and irreversible harm. It no longer shocked, but it still informed, and that influence spread in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to deny. For the family, life unfolded with a cautious confidence they hadn't allowed themselves before. They made long-term plans without the subconscious hesitation that had once shadowed every decision. Holidays felt different now, no longer suspended between hope and dread. There were still moments when grief surged unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a smell, a memory that surfaced without warning. But those moments no longer unraveled them. They had learned how to hold pain without letting it define every corner of their lives. The truth, once feared, had become a framework rather than a weapon. They kept her presence alive in practical ways, through scholarships, through quiet acts of service, through speaking engagements that focused less on the crime and more on resilience. When they spoke, they emphasized the human cost of waiting, the way unanswered questions can stall entire lives. They didn't glamorize the investigation or the outcome. They spoke about endurance, about the necessity of hope tempered by realism, about how justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice altered. Elsewhere, cold case units multiplied, often citing this investigation as evidence that patience combined with science could yield results once thought impossible. Funding bodies, influenced by public interest and demonstrated success, allocated resources to evidence testing that had long been considered impractical. Shelves of box materials, once treated as archival artifacts, were reopened, re-examined, given another chance to speak. Not every box contained answers, but the act of listening itself changed institutional culture. Silence was no longer acceptable simply because it was old. The case also influenced how communities talked about safety. The language shifted from fear-based warnings to awareness-based engagement. People were encouraged not to withdraw, but to connect more intentionally. Neighborhoods invested in communication rather than surveillance, in relationships rather than suspicion. The understanding grew that isolation is fertile ground for harm, and that attention, mutual accountability, and openness are quiet forms of prevention. In academic circles, the case became a study not only in forensic advancement, but in cognitive bias. Papers analyzed how early assumptions had shaped investigative direction, how the comfort of familiarity had dulled scrutiny. These analyses weren't indictments. They were explorations, attempts to understand how even experienced professionals can be guided by narratives they don't realize they're telling themselves. The conclusion was sobering and empowering at once. Bias is inevitable, but awareness can blunt its force. The media, having moved on to fresher stories, occasionally circled back with retrospectives that framed the case as emblematic of a broader shift in justice. These pieces were quieter than the original coverage, more reflective, less interested in twists, and more in timelines. The absence of urgency allowed for nuance. The story was no longer about a shocking reveal, but about endurance, accountability, and the slow reconciliation between past and present. For younger generations who encounter the case through these retellings, it carried a different weight. They saw it not as a cautionary tale from a distant era, but as proof that systems evolve, that persistence matters, and that truth is not bound by the limitations of its moment. It shaped their expectations of justice, not as something swift or dramatic, but as something that demands sustained attention and moral patience. The convicted man's presence faded almost entirely from public consciousness. His name became shorthand, then a footnote, then a reference only specialists recognized. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate shift in focus away from perpetrators and toward impact. The narrative no longer revolved around who committed the crime, but around what the crime had done and how its resolution reshaped lives and institutions. In that reframing, power moved away from notoriety and toward accountability. Within the original neighborhood, the story was now told sparingly, usually when prompted by circumstance rather than habit. When new residents asked about the area's history, the answer was measured, factual, stripped of embellishment. There was an unspoken agreement to respect the gravity of what had happened without letting it dominate the present. The past was acknowledged, not rehearsed. Remembered, not relived. Detectives who had been early in their careers during the investigation found themselves mentoring a new generation shaped by its lessons. They spoke about patience without romanticizing it, about diligence without promising resolution. They emphasized the importance of documentation, of preserving context, of treating every detail as potentially significant even when it seems trivial. The case had taught them that time is not neutral, that it can either erode truth or reveal it, depending on how carefully one prepares. For those still waiting on answers in other cases, the story was both inspiration and caution. It offered proof that resolution is possible, but it also illustrated the cost of waiting, the years that cannot be returned even when justice arrives. Advocates used it to argue for better support systems for families of the missing, for mental health resources that acknowledge the unique strain of unresolved loss. The case became part of a larger conversation about how society treats those suspended in uncertainty. As years continued to pass, the case's presence became more philosophical than emotional. It raised questions about memory, about how communities absorb trauma and move forward without forgetting. It challenged the idea that closure is a singular event, suggesting instead that it is a series of adjustments, each one allowing a little more space for life to expand again. On quiet evenings, when the streets settled into familiar rhythms, the knowledge of what had once been hidden there did not provoke fear so much as mindfulness. The ordinary was no longer taken for granted. People noticed patterns. They checked in. They listened, not because they expected danger, but because they understood that attention is a form of care, and care is the strongest counterweight to silence. The case, once defined by what was missing, had transformed into a measure of what remained. Connection, awareness, responsibility. It demonstrated that while time can obscure truth, it can also amplify the consequences of ignoring it. The years between disappearance and resolution were not erased by the verdict. They were integrated into a larger understanding of justice as a process that extends beyond courts and sentences into the fabric of everyday life. Even as the details blurred for those not directly touched by it, the core remained intact. A woman mattered. Her absence mattered. The waiting mattered. And the eventual reckoning mattered, not because it fixed what was broken, but because it acknowledged it. In that acknowledgement, there was dignity, and in dignity, there was a quiet form of restoration. The cold case had long since stopped being cold. It had become something warmer, heavier, more complex, a story that carried both warning and wisdom. It lived on not in headlines or documentaries, but in altered behavior, in institutional shifts, in the way people learn to question what seems obvious and to respect what remains unresolved. And as long as those lessons endured, the silence that once protected the truth would remain broken, not by noise, but by sustained attention, the kind that listens even when nothing appears to be happening at all. Time did not close around the case the way many expected it to. Instead of shrinking into a historical footnote, it expanded outward, touching conversations and decisions far removed from the original crime. It became a reference point whenever someone questioned the reliability of appearances, whenever an investigator hesitated before dismissing an old lead, whenever a family refused to let a file gather dust. The story no longer belonged to a single year or a single place. It had slipped into the collective bloodstream, subtle but persistent. In courtrooms across the state, attorneys occasionally invoked the case without naming it, alluding to the danger of certainty built too quickly, to the cost of assumptions left unchallenged. Judges listened differently when evidence preservation was discussed, more aware of how tomorrow's technology might interrogate today's conclusions. The past had made them cautious. It had taught them that finality, when rushed, can be a form of injustice. For the family, anniversaries were no longer markers of loss alone. They became moments of evaluation, quiet checkpoints where they measured how far they had come and how much they still carried. Some years felt lighter than others. Some years reopened old fractures. But the rhythm of remembrance had changed. It was less about what had been taken and more about what had endured. Love, memory, presence. These are not erased by time or by answers. They continued to meet people who felt compelled to tell them where they were when the news broke, when the arrest was announced, when the DNA evidence finally spoke. These confessions were offered softly, as if proximity to the moment conferred responsibility. The family accepted them with grace, understanding that the case had intersected with many lives in quiet ways. Trauma has a ripple effect, and resolution does not erase those ripples. It simply changes their shape. The investigation itself became a teaching tool in law enforcement academies. Recruits studied the file not for its sensational elements, but for its patience. They learned how evidence can wait, how context can shift, how technology can resurrect details once considered inert. Instructors emphasized humility, the willingness to revisit conclusions without defensiveness. The case stood as proof that certainty should always be provisional, that every answer carries an expiration date dictated by progress. Outside institutional walls, the story influenced how people understood trust. Conversations about community safety grew more nuanced, less binary. The idea that danger comes from strangers alone lost its grip. People spoke openly about intuition, about the importance of noticing inconsistencies without succumbing to paranoia. The case had taught them that vigilance does not require fear, only attention. In the digital age, fragments of the story circulated endlessly, detached from context, reshaped by algorithms, and shortened for consumption. This fragmentation worried some who knew the depth of what had occurred. They feared that the lesson might be reduced to spectacle, stripped of its complexity. In response, educators and advocates worked to reframe the narrative, to restore its layers, to insist that understanding requires more than a headline or a twist. The original investigators, now largely removed from the public eye, watched these developments with quiet interest. They had never sought recognition. Their satisfaction came from knowing that the work mattered beyond its immediate outcome. They had been part of something larger than a single case, something that altered how the future would approach the past. That knowledge settled into them like a slow, steady pride. Some of them still dreamed about the investigation, not in scenes of violence, but in images of paperwork, of evidence bags, of late nights spent rereading statements. These dreams were not nightmares. They were reminders of responsibility, of the weight carried during those years of uncertainty. Even solved cases leave impressions. They shape the mind's landscape, carving channels where thought returns again and again. The convicted man's silence remained unbroken, but it no longer held the fascination it once did. His refusal to explain was now understood as a limitation rather than a mystery. The truth no longer depended on his words. Science had spoken. Evidence had testified. The absence of confession did not diminish accountability. In that realization, the case underscored a powerful shift. Justice no longer waits for cooperation from those who wish to withhold it. As forensic databases expanded globally, the case was cited in discussions about ethical balance. How far should technology reach? What safeguards are necessary to prevent misuse? The story provided a grounding example, illustrating both the power and the responsibility that accompany scientific advancement. It reminded decision-makers that tools are only as just as the intentions guiding them. In communities still haunted by unresolved disappearances, the case offered a strange kind of companionship. It did not promise resolution, but it acknowledged endurance. Families shared strategies for surviving the long wait, for maintaining identity beyond grief. They spoke about the importance of rituals, of marking time even when answers refused to arrive. The case became part of a shared language of resilience. Media portrayals evolved as well. Early dramatizations gave way to more restrained interpretations, narratives that resisted easy conclusions. Filmmakers and writers approached the story with caution, aware of its impact and its complexity. Some succeeded in honoring its depth. Others failed, but the conversation itself signaled progress. The demand for responsible storytelling had grown louder, shaped in part by the consequences of past excess. Within the neighborhood, subtle traditions emerged. Neighbors checked on each other during storms. They shared information more freely. They noticed when routines changed. None of this was formalized. It was simply how people lived now, informed by memory rather than fear. The case had taught them that community is not passive. It is an active practice, renewed daily through attention and care. Children who grew up there absorbed these values without fully knowing their origin. They learned to speak up, to trust their instincts, to look beyond appearances. The story became a backdrop rather than a script, shaping behavior without dominating it. In this way, the past educated the future quietly, effectively. The legal system, often criticized for its rigidity, showed signs of adaptation influenced by cases like this one. Review boards were established. Evidence retention policies were strengthened. Mechanisms for reopening investigations were clarified. None of these changes were dramatic on their own. Together, they represented a shift toward humility, an acknowledgement that justice is not a fixed state, but an evolving pursuit. As decades layered themselves over the original crime, the case resisted simplification. It remained complex, unresolved in some emotional sense, even as it was legally settled. That tension became part of its lesson. Some wounds do not close cleanly. Some truths arrive too late to restore what was lost. Acknowledging this does not negate justice. It deepens it. The family, now further removed from the moment of revelation, spoke less about the case publicly, not because it mattered less, but because it had become integrated into their lives. They no longer needed to explain it to themselves or to others. It existed alongside joy, alongside growth, alongside futures once imagined as impossible. The story no longer defined them. It accompanied them. Looking back, the case could be seen as a turning point, not just for those directly involved, but for a broader understanding of accountability. It demonstrated that time can be challenged, that silence can be interrogated, that truth does not expire. But it also showed the cost of waiting, the years lived in suspension, the lives shaped by absence. In the end, what endured was not the shock of the reveal or the drama of the arrest. It was the quieter transformation that followed. The way people learned to question, to preserve, to revisit. The way institutions adjusted. The way a community practiced care. The case had moved beyond its origin, becoming less about what happened in 1996 and more about how its echoes continued to shape the present. The cold case had become a mirror, reflecting both vulnerability and strength. It reminded anyone who looked closely that justice is rarely clean, rarely complete, but always worth pursuing. And as long as that pursuit continued, informed by memory and guided by attention, the story would remain alive, not as a wound, but as a warning, a lesson, and a testament to the persistence of truth. The story did not conclude with a verdict or a sentence, because stories like this never truly conclude. They settle, they embed themselves into habits and instincts, into the way people think before they speak and pause before they assume. Years after the case was officially closed, its presence could still be felt in the quiet recalibration of trust. In a way, ordinary interactions were now filtered through a deeper awareness of complexity. The ending had arrived on paper, but in life, the reverberations continued. For the family, the final stage was not about letting go, but about choosing how to carry what remained. They no longer measured time by the distance from disappearance to discovery. Instead, they marked it by growth, by resilience, by the moments when laughter came without guilt and joy arrived without hesitation. They understood now that moving forward was not a betrayal of memory. It was an affirmation of it. The life that had been interrupted still mattered, still shaped the present, not through pain alone, but through purpose. They spoke less frequently about justice and more about meaning. Justice had been addressed in court, defined by statute and procedure. Meaning was something else entirely. It lived in the choices they made, the causes they supported, the people they comforted. It lived in the way they refused to let the case become a spectacle, insisting instead on dignity. They had learned that closure is not silence. It is the ability to speak without being undone. The case continued to surface in professional circles as a benchmark, a reminder that the timeline of truth does not align neatly with human impatience. Investigators cited it when arguing for evidence retention, for funding, for the reconsideration of cases written off too quickly. It had become shorthand for persistence, for the idea that the past is not fixed, only waiting. In this way, the case contributed to an institutional memory that extended far beyond its original jurisdiction. As technology advanced, the story gained new relevance. Each breakthrough in forensic science renewed the conversation about what might still be hidden, not just in this case, but in thousands of others. The lesson was no longer hypothetical. It was proven. Evidence speaks when given the chance. Time, once the enemy, could become an ally if met with patience and preparation. Public interest, once intense, had matured into something quieter and more respectful. The case was no longer consumed as entertainment. It was referenced, studied, remembered. This shift mattered. It reflected a broader cultural change, a growing discomfort with sensationalism, and a deeper appreciation for nuance. People began to understand that real crimes do not resolve themselves in neat arcs, and that the human cost extends far beyond the moment of revelation. In the neighborhood, life continued in its unremarkable way, which now felt like an achievement rather than an assumption. Children grew up, houses changed hands, routines evolved. Yet beneath the surface, there was a shared understanding that safety is not passive. It is cultivated. The case had taught them that vigilance does not mean suspicion, and that community is built through presence rather than fear. Those who had lived through the years of uncertainty carried a different posture now. They listened more carefully. They noticed more. They understood that danger rarely announces itself, and that silence can be deceptive. This awareness did not make them anxious. It made them attentive. It sharpened their sense of responsibility to one another. The legal system, shaped incrementally by cases like this one, continued its slow evolution. Review mechanisms were strengthened. Cold case units became permanent fixtures rather than temporary experiments. The idea that a case could be revisited without shame gained acceptance. Finality was no longer synonymous with infallibility. This shift did not erase past failures, but it acknowledged them, creating space for correction. For families still waiting on answers elsewhere, the story remained a double-edged presence. It offered hope, but it also underscored the cost of waiting. Advocates used it to argue for better support, for recognition of the unique strain endured by those living in limbo. The case became part of a collective narrative about endurance, about the need to care for people even when outcomes are uncertain. The man responsible for the crime faded almost completely from the narrative. His identity, once shocking in its ordinariness, lost its power. He became irrelevant to the story's final meaning. The focus shifted fully to